into the conversation today. For our listeners, what is the one piece of key information that our listeners need to know about you so that they understand the context of where you're coming from and how your opinions on the various topics that we're going to talk about have been formed?
Sure. So I think the characteristic that's most important about me, that will probably shape a lot of our conversations, is that my background has been very product focused before switching into an engineering lead role. And so a lot of the approaches and decisions that we've made on an engineering side has really been shaped by my strong
Okay,
product
cool. So
background.
you're not a developer, not touched code before really until doing dev management stuff.
I took one very entry level coding class in college, so I don't think I can qualify as a developer at all.
That's really interesting. From the product perspective, then that seems like an interesting transition to me, and some of the listeners are probably like, "Oh, that's curious. What does that look like? What's kind of the unique perspective that product brings into your role right now, and what is like your role title, and what are you responsible for?"
Yeah, so my role title today is CRM Development Manager at Cision. And my product background really was shaped from starting really as a business analyst, is how I kind of got into IT to begin with, and working through being a BA and product program management. All of the questions and like understanding from a functional perspective around how systems work has really helped me understand what has to be done from a development perspective to make sure that we're partnering and working with the product side to really make sure that the product functions the way we need it to. So a little bit around how that has kind of come into play is that as a business analyst, as a product owner, as a product management, and all those type of roles, it's really important to ask the right
Mm.
questions, why and how. And I think some of our developers, they are really focused on just getting it done, especially in an environment where it's really busy and fast paced. And so my perspective around kind of pausing and asking the why and how end users are going to use it has really helped our development team, I think, shape the way that they approach development as well. So it's a little bit of that, like understanding the functional piece that ties over and carries really well over into successful development around quality features
Yeah,
that we
absolutely.
release.
Is that something that you have to continuously work on with the team that you manage, like to keep them mindful of asking the right questions and making sure that things are being validated and built correctly?
Oh, for sure. And it's because we're just really, you get really in the
Yeah.
weeds really fast. It's very easy to do in any group, any project I've ever been a part of in my career. Even myself, like you get involved in something, you're just going, going, going. It's hard to stop that train once it starts leaving the station. But when you are like in full speed ahead and want to really kind of make sure you're on the right track, right? You pause, you have to ask those questions. And sometimes it's really important that we do slow down and think about like what it is that we're working through to identify all the different potential use cases, scenarios, the making sure we got all of our I's dotted and our T's crossed before we deploy things to make sure we're eliminating risk that we're putting in, potential
Yeah,
bugs or
absolutely.
something like
Is
that.
there anything common from a developer standpoint that you've typically seen not really being taken into consideration more frequently than others, or is there any? I'm trying to phrase this the right way to kind of answer it. But is there any kind of common things that get overlooked in a development process in terms of understanding what users want and what the business needs versus building or just writing the Apex code or building the flow or whatever it is?
I'm not sure if it's one thing over the other. I will say that in an organization that's super complex, has very complicated like business processes, especially when you're working with a system like CRMs, Salesforce specifically, we service the entire organization. So several different departments, several different people have different needs. And so I think to any project team or development team as a whole, it's always hard to understand like how different teams use your system. So understanding all those different business needs and functionalities, and then trying to implement a solution that meets the needs of not just one user group, but like a scalable solution that could be applied to others in the future. I think that's a challenge across all teams in general, just because it is very complex and complicated.
How do you manage that, and how do you get them thinking and talking to the users? Does your development team talk directly to users, or do you rely on the product and BA relationships to be like a middleman, if you will, or something else?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So we definitely start off with our product team to gather requirements, understanding those features that need to be implemented. But then after that, depending, of course, on the complexity, our developers really are very much like client, customer facing, and user facing. They'll meet with our business users quite frequently to make sure we're understanding, doing demos, specifically in the demo POC phases of our initiatives. We are right there in those meetings, making sure we're understanding how the end user wants to use it, touch it, feel it, all of the things. And so those are really powerful to make sure that we have their expectations understood, and that if there is an approach that we took because we want it to be more scalable, or we need it to be a little bit more flexible for something down the road that we need to just kind of keep in the back of our heads that we know might be coming. Those are always really good conversations, because then we're educating our end users, who are generally not technical, right? At any means. They have no idea. They're like, they see magic happen. And so we kind of expose the magic a little bit to them so that they can also understand and become more familiar and educated with some of the technology and activities that are
such an awesome approach. I think something that I've talked about regularly has been the communication and making sure developers or admins do talk to the end users as much as possible, and there is that clear line of communication. But what you said that just there is really interesting about also communicating back to the end users about why decisions have been made and to show them the magic. That's a really interesting concept. I've never actually considered that before, and why that's important. So that's really interesting, because I think that's a topic that gets brought up a lot. Talk to your users, understand your users and what they want, but that two-way communication is super valuable and super important. Speaking of things being important, what are the things that you and your role care about the most? What does the CRM development manager care about the most?
Ooh, that's a tough question. I think accountability, communication, and respect. All those are really top items that I care about as a manager. Making sure that there's respect across the teams, that we respect different perspectives, different approaches, different ideas. There's so many different ways you can approach solutions and creative solutions for business problems. So keeping an open door and open mind around different ways that we can solve problems, I think, is really important. I think it's a really critical way to foster collaboration across the team as well. Communication, of course, we want to be, and I said accountability, and they kind of go hand in hand. We really want to be accountable for meeting our timelines, being present at, meetings, and being able to meet the project needs and the demands of the business. And so holding ourselves accountable, but communicating when we think that something might not go as planned, and making sure we're surfacing any risks as soon as we possibly can. And a little bit that goes back to the previous comments around like showing the magic, right? Like making sure we're communicating if there are complexities, like why and how we can help educate our end users around those complexities. I think really helps our team be accountable for what we own as developers, and then also own what we deliver to the end users and how
it's all very circular, isn't it? Communication and accountability will build respect.
It is, yeah.
Yeah. Is there anything that you feel that you and the team have done at Cision quite well to build that? Is there any like kind of examples that you think, yes, we did that really well and that's benefited us down the line?
Yeah, we have a lot of examples. Our team has done just an outstanding job of partnering with our product team and our business end users, really showcasing different features and like approaches to solving complex problems. One of them specifically was we transitioned to lead-based selling earlier in 2023. And so that was a really big change for not just like a sales operational process, but also from a system. And there was a lot of different approaches being thrown around that the business and the other end users thought would be like very tailored and complex. And there was a lot of conversations around where we could come into play around how to simplify the process to scale it using out of box functionality, and then how to customize certain pieces rather than the whole thing. And so it was just a really great collaborative conversation between business, between technology, understanding how Salesforce works and how to choose the right approach. And it was a really great, I think, project that went really well. And now we're successfully running as a lead-based
That's
selling
amazing.
sales group.
That's it's such an interesting thing, and one of my friends in the ecosystem talks about this regularly. Jody Herbeck, she talks about you have the Salesforce knowledge, your team has the Salesforce knowledge and knows what can and cannot be done, and that collaboration to make the business understand that and mold it to what the requirements are is so important. And that now that the team's up and running in lead based selling fashion is testament to that knowledge and that collaboration for sure. What a great example! I love that.
Yeah, we created a POC. It was really
Yeah,
cool. It was
absolutely.
great.
You mentioned lots of different stakeholders there in the business, of course, with
Mhm.
that project specifically, but project stakeholders that you work with, end users and product. Uh, who typically tends to be the stakeholders that are less frequently involved? We're familiar with working with product and end users for sure, but who else is involved in projects typically that can make or break a project, and you need to make sure that you connect with them regularly or make sure that they have all the information to be able to make decisions?
Yeah, it's really hard to say if there's just one, but there's a couple that come to mind. The first one is legal. It's always legal. There's always something. Like, don't forget about the lawyers. They are very important. But especially when you're in an organization that has several hundred different products that you're selling and bundling and making available to customers globally, it's really, really important that the way your contracts are formed, your amendments are organized, the wording, is very specific. And so making sure legal is in the conversation from the beginning, like from a product sales perspective, is crucial. Another user group that I feel like probably doesn't get enough face time, but is equally as important to everyone, is definitely finance. So much of the data that Salesforce contains is imperative to ensuring that we're billing our clients the right way, that we're bringing in revenue, that we're tracking sales effectively, and that we have a strong way to organize our pipeline and understand potential revenue. So yeah, it's really all very crucial, but there's so many other stakeholders that we work with that
Yeah,
are also
I can think of a colleague of mine, Ben. So if Ben's listening to this, he's going to be screaming yes at what you just said about getting finance involved and identifying all of that, for sure. That's a really interesting point about legal too. So I think from a selling motion perspective as well, that understanding that legal are involved in
yeah.
contracting and all of that side of things as well might be
Yes.
super easy to overlook, I guess. Um, Even from my experience as an AE, legal was right there, but you don't really think about it until the time that you need them. So it's just something that we
Yep.
spoke about before coming on the call is like kind of prior planning and having a little bit more visibility and insight to what's happening. How do you ensure that you plan correctly for a project and that everybody is involved that needs to be? And what does that look like successfully?
Yeah. Oh man, that is tough. Because I think every project has a different approach. There's always like a framework that I like to take just around checklists and documentation. But after every project, there's always lessons learned, and that just kind of evolves over time. But for us, from a planning perspective, it's just understanding like who are those key players, making sure we have the right people in the room when we start conversations around what the project or needs might be, and then making sure that we're including them effectively in all the conversations, in the POCs, making sure that we're not forget. I think the really big one, like I keep mentioning, and I keep going back to, is just having the right people there and having the right folks contribute to the conversation, providing feedback, identifying those decision makers so that we can, obviously move forward with decisions and approaches. But that's starting with the people is like number one in my plan. And then after that, it's generally around technical approach and how we want to solve for that. What are our options? What is going to make the most sense? And diving into that with our product side, making sure that they're aligned and that our approach matches exactly what they're looking for. And then after that, it's really just how do we execute, test effectively, find all the bugs, make sure that we, didn't leave anything out, and beta test and then release. So a little bit of that. It's very like, your general structure, but starting with the
I
people
love hearing
is the
that.
most
People
important.
people is the thing I talk about most, and it's great to hear it in practice and organizations practicing it. You mentioned lessons learned just there when you were talking about prior projects, and they build over time. Do you do like burn downs of projects and like really like analyze how things went to then form later decisions and later projects, or?
Yeah, nothing the way our team runs, it's nothing really formal. We do retros after large projects. And so it's really based off of those retrospects from the team and getting the feedback around like what went well and what we could have learned from. So it's a lot around those type of activities where we've just kind of reframed it and say, okay, like let's do that differently next time. So it's really more around like the retros, and then even just casual conversations. Nothing, like I said, like our team, what we try to do instead of like create these like formal rules, we do want to make it a little bit more like conversational. Obviously, our team right now, I shouldn't say obviously, but our team right now is all remote. And so working in these remote environments, sometimes it's hard to have those organic interactions where sometimes you used
Right.
to be in a meeting room and you sit there next to somebody and be like, I wish we would have done X, Y, and Z just like casually in conversation. Those casual like comments
Mm.
don't come up anymore. So we do try to make it not super strict where everybody has to share, but just in as the project's going on too, right? Instead of
Mm.
waiting to the end. Like we might be week 1 or week 2 into the project and say, okay, how is this working for us? Like, is this, the way we want to continue to proceed? Should we start doing things differently? Are we on track to be success, set us up for success, and just having those
Yeah.
conversations as the project's
Yeah,
going.
absolutely. I think that's the most frequent comment that I've heard since COVID is
Yeah.
those organic conversations or water cooler conversations, if you like, don't usually happen.
Yeah.
Has the team always been remote, and are you still
Mhm.
remote because of that situation? Oh,
Our
okay.
team has always been remote. When I started the organization in 2021, it was remote because of COVID, and then a lot of like the restrictions were lifted. But our team at that time, they had already hired so many folks that were just all over not only the United States but globally. Um, we've just remained
I mean, it sounds like it's working.
remote.
You
Yeah.
told us about such a successful project already. If it's working, then that's fantastic for sure.
Yeah, it's definitely an added challenge. I miss being in a room and whiteboarding, and I think a lot of our other folks do too. But we've
Yeah, for
found
sure.
ways to be
Adopted new technology and what have you in the process for sure. So I
exactly.
want to talk a little bit about the the actual development processes that you follow, like on Salesforce.
Yeah.
So you
Mhm.
are a GearSet customer, asterisk, and like highlight that highlight that straight away. So as a team lead, somebody that's not in the actual development process, you don't personally deploy things yourself, and you're in that leadership position. What's important to you across that process, and what do you want to either have visibility over or know about when the team is developing and releasing and observing?
Yeah, I think the most important piece for that is making sure my team, like what's important to me is making sure my team has what they need to be successful truly, and that they can understand how to communicate back to me if they need support. And so, what I think what's really great about the gear set tool is that it allows us to see the visibility around those changes and understand and organize. Okay, like here's what's different, here's what doesn't work, or here's where there's a disconnect for us to do our deployment successfully and see all the lovely greens that we like to see in gear set. And so, having that ability for my team to like easily visualize the data structures, understand what we're deploying, what are those changes, and then being able to communicate that back to me very easily just because a tool allows them to easily communicate that back to me, I think is really powerful. And then really that's kind of for me from like a management leadership perspective, it's just making sure that my team, like I mentioned, has what they need to be successful. And I think Gearset
Yeah,
allows
of
them to do
course.
that.
That ties back in, that being able for them to communicate back where things are ties into what you're saying about project management. And, if you know where things are in stages,
Yeah.
then you can hold yourself accountable to the timelines that you also mentioned. And that's really important.
Yeah.
As a kind of general comment there, making sure that your team has what they need to be successful. How does your relationship work with your team so that you can make sure that they have what they need and they can communicate with that with you effectively, whether it be tooling or support,
Yeah.
learning processes, whatever it be?
Yeah, it's really just starting off by asking the question. And my team is incredibly open and knows that I can dive in and help escalate wherever. And so, and because I'm also a very curious person, I make them show me
Okay.
everything all the time. So if there's anything even code related, I'm like, show it to me. And so we'll walk through it together. So although I'm not a coder, I can understand what it is that they're doing. And I can help probably like problem solve there from that perspective. And so it's really just like making sure they have the right tools for success. For instance, actually, a perfect example is that we were really struggling with keeping up our lower environments to align with our production environment, specifically around product level CPQ changes. We have a lot of products and we are constantly making changes to CPQ. And up until recently, it was very manual. Everything we were doing for these very complicated product validations and rules were incredibly manual. And so we recently just implemented the CPQ feature of GearSet. And like that was a piece where we're like, what can we do differently? How can we get better about making sure our lower environments match what we're putting into production? Um, our our process has always been QA, UAT, and then production. However, a lot of projects, just because of timelines or business needs, specifically from product setup perspective, we don't have that luxury to do all the lower environments. Sometimes we just have to put it in production, which hurts my soul. But the process, okay, go back into your other environment, set it up, and then now, we have something that should be close to production so that we can run testing effectively and we won't run into bugs on different tickets that aren't
Yeah.
actual bugs. That said, we just implemented the CPQ piece. And so that was a tool that we needed because of all those manual steps involved in our setting it up in the lower environments. Now we don't have to do that. It's all quickly automated for us. We see the checks, we can understand what works, but what were the specific product level attributes or CPQ attributes that we're changing, and we can just track it easier. And now we can even do like quick rollbacks if something goes wrong. So there's just so much benefit to that tool. And so that's an example of where we identified where time was being spent, where we were seeing like potential issues, just like I mentioned, users were testing and things were looking different in lower environments. And then we're like, oh, that's why. We never went back and made the manual updates just because we had to move on to the next task. We're, going. And so yeah, anyway, so we've just tried to
For
streamline
sure.
that as much as
Something that
possible.
you've mentioned a couple of times in this conversation already is being testing and quality. How much emphasis do you put on
Hmm.
testing and quality and making sure that things happen? Because oftentimes it's one of the things that I find gets overlooked a little bit in Salesforce teams, but you've mentioned it repeatedly through this conversation. Like
Hmm.
why is that, and why is that so front of mind for you?
Yeah, so I think our organization and our team specifically is unique in the sense we have dedicated QA engineers. So we actually have a set of QA team members dedicated to Salesforce releases. So we have a very formal testing process that they run through too, to making sure they have several scripts, they have their test cases, and they do a lot of testing before we get to the end users to help find those bugs, do issue remediation, and then get us to a point where we can successfully have a UAT or a user acceptance test for the business to sign off on. So our organization as a whole, it's really part of our like IT culture to dedicate time in your project plan for
Okay,
QA and
interesting.
testing.
Interesting. Um, is there any history behind that? That IT, you mentioned IT culture. That's can often be something that's
Yeah.
embedded into the culture, like you say, or you kind of have to bring it in and say it's causing problems down the line. It's either causing rework issues or what have you. Is there any kind of history, like in the organization, that makes testing so important?
I think there was some examples that happened before I even joined the organization, but specifically, I think people were just doing a lot, like individual, like it was just a lot of work for individuals to wear a lot of different hats, and so things were getting overlooked. And then leadership realized we need to actually test and dedicate resources to testing to make sure that we're taking the load off of other individuals who might not have that strong QA engineering experience. And so that was really a leadership decision to help eliminate risks that they were seeing because there was just a lot of pressure on individual
Yeah,
folks at the time. So they tried to just
yeah.
help with
So,
that bandwidth.
how do you or how do you stay accountable to leadership and make sure that you're meeting the requirements that leadership set for you?
So great question. We do report outs pretty regularly to our leadership team, proof of concepts. My product delivery team, so our product side, they own a lot of that report out, road mapping initiatives, making sure that we're aligning with their needs, and then the business roadmaps as well. So we have a lot of just ongoing communication and report out sessions just to keep everybody on the same page around what we're working on. There's constant change all the time. It's a really like exciting business because of all of the mergers and acquisitions that our organization has gone through. So a lot of meetings to make sure that everybody is on the same page and that we're addressing what's top of mind to
Yeah,
the business
yeah,
at the
for
moment.
sure, for sure. Mergers and acquisitions is an interesting one. It's fairly common in the business space that we're in now, and kind of the world
Yeah.
as it stands. You know, business get bought. I think it's one of those things that's fairly common for either consultancies to think about, or industry wide changes and what have you.
Mhm.
How do you, from your experience, a lot of you mentioned a lot of mergers and acquisitions happening at Cision. Um, how do you make mergers and acquisitions successful when it comes to technology? Because it often involves a lot of consolidation. Sometimes it involves org merges or tool consolidation and what have you. How do you approach that, and what are the key things to consider?
So we really haven't done too much. We've let it sit. A lot of it lets it sit for a time being before we jump into it. But we work really closely with our business partners to understand exactly what the vision is, because with mergers and acquisitions there's a lot of more strategic decisions that have to happen around where they see the organization in a year, 3 years, 5 years. And so making sure our technology aligns with those visions at each point is really important. I think so far our approach has really been, what can we do to get better? And so to do that, to your point, we've started the conversations around CRM consolidations. And so the decisions are still out there. No, there's still a lot of planning involved, but I jokingly say that we sit there and wait because there is so much planning involved. It's really important that the decisions that you make from a technology perspective are the scalable solutions and not just the short-term solutions. So the planning period might take a little bit longer than probably folks want to admit. But it's really critical because, like I said, it'll impact the future, of the organization many years out.
I think this conversation has been really nice because it's really come full circle in terms of everything that you were talking about at the start and everything we've come to talking about now in terms of planning and succession, and also not just planning for the sake of planning, but planning for vision too, which it doesn't say, you say you sit there and wait, but it doesn't sound like you're sitting there and waiting, just twiddling your thumbs, not doing anything. It's planning and waiting to make sure that you can execute on wider goals. And I think that's really important, especially if you have the lines of communication that you mentioned that you do have open, then everybody kind of knows what's going on, and you have that knowledge in your team about what can be achieved with Salesforce or what have you, and that can all come in nicely. So I think whatever you end up doing is going to be super, super, super successful, for sure. Lauren, is there anything final that you want to leave the listeners with, whether that be a piece of advice or a key learning or takeaway that you've learned that's been really helpful in your career that can help potentially anybody?
Oh, that is a great question. Let me think. Can I get a second to think about that? Because
of course you can.
Okay. I think the biggest piece of advice that I could say that has helped, I think, like myself be successful in my role and just, our teams and work really well together, is to ask why. I think there, in any respect, just like if someone presents a problem to you that they need to have resolved, or it's like understanding like what is the root cause and why are we solving for that problem. When someone says they can't do something, even from like a leadership perspective, I can't do this. It's like, okay, well, why? And then like understanding like how to break that down. So really just breaking it down into as many pieces as possible that's manageable, and then you can kind of wrap your head around the different parts, because there are some really large complex ideas and problems out there, but by breaking it down and asking why, you can at least start tackling pieces of it to get to the larger complex problem. I think that has helped me quite a bit because of just, even from a product side, or starting as a business analyst, moving into product, and then crossing over into development management, understanding and breaking it down has really helped us just achieve different needs. It might not be the full thing, but it's at least part of it to show progress, to help us make way for the future, and continue to just like improve our communication skills and work with others and collaborate and like, yeah. Yes.
When you said always ask why, I was like, spoken like a true business analyst and product person at heart, for sure. Cool. Lauren, thank you so much for your time. Really insightful conversation, and I hope the listeners have enjoyed listening to this conversation as much as I've enjoyed being a part of it. Some really useful stuff and some really, really perfect full circle kind of moments through there. So Lauren, I really appreciate your time and coming onto the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.